Hi, Katherine, and thank you for joining us again in our Climate Responsibility in Banking series. And this month, we're going to be talking about greenwashing, as that is a word that makes its way around the climate space a lot. So the first question I'd love to ask is, firstly, just to cover the basics, what is greenwashing?
Oh, good question. I'm sure there's an official definition of it, but the one that I like using is really easy to remember. It's the intersection of two behaviors: poor environmental performance and positive communication about environmental performance. Okay. And some examples include highlighting positive aspects of one's performance, so a bank's performance, while overlooking to mention all the others that are much more damaging and much more negative. So focusing on a little tiny positive issue here whilst overlooking the elephant in the room over there. And a classic one from old established banks is they love highlighting their renewable energy credentials, right? So they would tout them as their massive success. They've just lent $100 million or £100 million to a renewable energy project. And in the meantime, they have $2 billion of lending to the fossil fuel industry, right? So their support for renewable energy just pales in comparison to their ongoing support to the fossil fuel industry. Or another good example is banks' claims of carbon neutrality. Very often they're based on them purchasing carbon credits, and very often within that is carbon credits that are coming off that have been generated by reforestation or afforestation or other forestry-based projects. Again, if we imagine a scenario where a bank is funding new fossil fuel infrastructure development over there, and by the way, there's plenty of deforestation that happens as you develop new infrastructure and build new pipelines. And then on the other hand, they're planting a few trees over there. These two projects or these two activities are not comparable in terms of impact. When you chop down a mature tree, that's hundreds of years of carbon sequestration released into the atmosphere at once, as opposed to this seedling over here will take 100 years to grow and sequester carbon. So in terms of its impact, this is a really damaging activity. That one is, we love trees, we need more trees, but not nearly enough to compensate for the deforestation that happened over there. So those are a couple of examples. There's plenty more, but that hopefully gives you a feel for what greenwashing is.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And thank you for distinguishing two kind of quite separate categories as how they can come across. And what might the incentives be for a bank to greenwash?
Yeah, so these days, customers expect companies that they do business with and buy from, and that includes banks. They expect them to be responsible, right? Operating in a responsible manner. And the banking sector, by and large, in most countries, is pretty competitive. There are hundreds of alternatives to choose from in the UK and the US and other countries. And banking is also incredibly complex, right? It is very difficult for individual consumers, the industry term is retail customers. It is really difficult for them to tell greenwashing from genuine efforts to improve climate performance. It's not like taking a known household product, reading a label, and it says it contains no sugar, and then you look at the list of ingredients and there's sugar, right? It's also difficult, but it's much, much easier than in case of banks, you'd have to look through thousands of documents, and some of the completely impenetrable to your just normal retail customer, right? And also it's not a requirement for banks to disclose their, for example, their lending to fossil fuel companies. Very often, even those of us who are quite experienced in this area, it's really difficult to find the source of truth. So it's easy for banks to get away with greenwashing.
And how can banks be penalized? What are some repercussions that they might encounter for greenwashing?
I think I'm right in saying that there's no law against greenwashing as such, but there are consequences in many countries for misleading consumers more generally, at least in the EU, UK, the US. And companies have been sued, for example, overstating the efficacy of their products. Delta Airlines, for example, was recently sued in California for making misleading carbon neutrality claims. And increasingly, there's also regulation that requires banks to disclose some data in accordance with a taxonomy, so standardized disclosures that allow us to identify some loopholes. So as I said, I don't think there's like greenwashing law as such, but there are other ways to hold banks accountable if they mislead consumers. So I think in the future, the trajectory is for more disclosure. And I think in the future, depending on which jurisdiction you're in, there'll be a day where banks will have to disclose their exposure to the fossil fuel sector. And that will hopefully help all of us, consumers and activists and advocates, to get a fuller picture. And so there will be more instances to hold banks accountable and fight these instances of greenwashing.
And then my last question in two parts is, what might be some red flags of a bank that might be greenwashing? And what should you do as a consumer if you are coming across a bank that you think might be greenwashing?
I love those questions. Red flags. There's so many. So it's fair to say that banks' lending and support for fossil fuel sector has been under the spotlight for quite some time now. And there's databases and there's websites that, just like Bank Green, would show you the extent to which banks lend to fossil fuel projects and companies. However, the backdoor that they've been using for the past few years is investment in bonds. So this is actually not lending like you would lend to a retail customer, but instead investing in bonds, essentially debt instruments that are issued by fossil fuel companies. Those are more difficult to detect. So a bank could, in theory, be saying that they have no lending to the sector, whilst they do have lending, it's just a different mechanism. The other one is very much just the way some of these statements can be worded. A bank can say that they do not fund fossil fuel projects, while at the same time they're continuing to fund fossil fuel companies and their day-to-day needs. So they may not necessarily be providing support for that new pipeline, but they may be providing support to the head office of the bank so they can buy paper clips and whatever else and pay their rent, right? So there's that, the semantics of it. The other thing that it's becoming increasingly popular is the whole issue of green bonds. And this can take a variety of forms. So this could be, again, banks investing in green bonds that are issued by, say, fossil fuel companies because they want to develop their renewable energy portfolio, or they want to invest in carbon capture equipment, something like this. So there's still banks lending, but there's also banks issuing bonds themselves. So they borrow. Right? A bank issuing a bond is a bank borrowing to finance some projects that they will then be lending onto investing in, right? The problem is money is fungible. So $100 in the bank is $100 in a bank, right? There's no way of ring fencing it. And also the way that the proceeds from that bond is used, if Bank of America is telling me that they need to issue a bond to invest in XYZ, I expect them to invest in XYZ, but it actually is difficult to hold banks accountable to actually doing the right thing and investing within the right timeframes, and not investing in some of those technologies that maybe seem to be green, but actually not, like biomass is a good example. So there's the whole issue of green bonds that has received quite a bit of criticism and has been under a bit of controversy. My absolute all-time favorite is paperless statements. Banks that would provide billions and trillions of dollars of funding to the fossil fuel sector. And yet when you look at their sustainability report, their proudest achievement is that they've helped customers go paperless, which a drop in the ocean doesn't even describe it. It's a rounding error. And paperless statements is just one example of the sort of distractions. Another one that we see quite a bit with sort of newer, maybe challenger banks, those institutions, they love giving you a personal carbon footprint calculator. And that's fine. I think it's a nice perk to have, and people are asking for it. But again, let's not forget that actually we want banks themselves to become more sustainable rather than just encouraging their consumers to do so. We need that as well, but let's not forget the big picture here. And then I mentioned earlier, banks planting trees, right? Don't get me wrong, we all love trees and they have multiple co-benefits like cleaner air. But again, let's put things into perspective here. No matter how many trees a bank plants, what really matters is whether they support the finance the fossil fuel industry and or renewable energy, and the mix of the two. That's where real impact is. All right, as to what you can actually do when you spot those instances of greenwashing, so many things. So first of all, check our website. It is possible that we've already exposed that instance of greenwashing that you've identified. So take a look at the bank's webpage and our website. And if we haven't, tell us about it. Contact us through the website so we can investigate and then update that bank page. If it's your bank, gosh, you can write to them, right? And we can provide some templated language for you to use and talk about it. We need to talk about climate change more, just generally with our friends, our families, with anyone who would listen. So let's just talk about it more and elevate this topic and bring this to the attention of more people.
Thank you so much, Katherine, and some really key actionable items for anyone who is wondering how they can help in the energy transition and how they can hold their banks accountable for trying to go to a greener future. And looking forward to seeing you next month, Katherine, for a new topic.
I'll be there. Take care.